Again, notice the numbers of these things, the proximity to the water. So what were they trying to do? What was the point of all this? Mound Bottom in Kingston Springs, Tennessee. When you study this stuff, what you begin to understand is that there seems to have been a number of waves of building activity. It wasn't a continuous process from 4,000 years ago until now. It was a process that went in cycles, and then it would quiet down for a while, and then there would be another cycle. The last wave of activity occurred between around 1000 AD and 1200 AD, and it was coincident with the building of the Gothic cathedrals in Europe. So while the last wave of this was going on, the Gothic cathedrals were being built in Europe. And there was also simultaneously the last great wave of Mayan structures being built in Mexico, and a tremendous building boom going on in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia and Thailand and Vietnam and so forth, building temples. And the episode of building lasted about 200 years. Here's another complex, Winterville Complex down in Mississippi. $3,700 years ago. That's 1700 BC. This one has not been dated yet. Again, the grid of squares, you can remember that the grid of squares, each square is around 760 feet on a side. So from here to here, roughly 760 feet, which is the same distance as the Great Pyramid of Giza on its base, 760 feet. Again, the omnipresent water. And of course, what I'm showing you here is only a small sampling of the thousands of these things that existed. In Mississippi, you can see the very tip of the plaza, you know, the complex of structures surrounding the plaza, the water flowing nearby. These are actually not the same complex, they just look similar. So you can see they dug a canal all the way around here to bring water to, again, to create this almost island effect. Some of the geometries involved in these are really quite amazing. And again, you can try to see some human figures right here that'll give you some sense of the scale. And really, what a tragedy that some of these, like this one, are basically almost gone. And it's through 19th century surveys and using a lot of remote sensing data, ground penetrating radar, excavations and so forth, that archaeologists have been able to reconstruct what was once there. This would have been an amazing complex here. And again, is it merely an artistic or an aesthetic impulse that leads to this, or is there actually a scientific basis to it as well? That, to me, is one of the questions raised by this. So this thing here is...
Which direction is north?
North is up. In all of these images here, north will be up unless otherwise indicated. So how much work had to go into creating something like this? An extraordinary amount of work. And the question that's got to be asked is, assuming the conventional models of North American prehistory, what we had was widely dispersed tribes, hunter-gatherers, some subsistence farming. But what in the world would be the motive for a hunter-gatherer society to create things like this? That's the mystery raised by this whole phenomenon. So here we're looking at a complex that was built 4,000 years ago. Here is a circle, a perfect geometric circle that's over 1,000 feet in diameter. No one has to ask themselves, why would a hunter-gatherer society be moved to go out and lay out a ringed structure 1,000 feet in diameter? Now, another factor that we find that, and I'm only going to show you one example of this, because this brings in another dimension of this whole phenomena that puts it completely on another level. Here is the Shiloh Complex in Tennessee, built during the last wave of construction activity around 1200 AD. I've forgotten which river flows by here, but they've built it right next to a river, probably whose banks were artificially straightened. And we have a layout here of objects. Oops, we'll come back to that one. We'll come back to that. I got something out of sequence here. This was the Portsmouth earthworks. This is the Ohio River, and it was a long serpentine kind of a thing that reached from here 7 miles over to here. And they had a causeway that was over 7 miles in length. This structure here, let's see if I have something about that. Okay, if we look down right here at this little thing, that's this. And the square itself, to give you a sense of the scale of this, that little square right there is 15 acres in extent. Now this doesn't exist anymore. The city of Portsmouth, Ohio has completely swallowed that up. The only thing that still exists is this mound right here. And it's in the middle of a city park. Yeah, now here is let's go back. Look at this set of ring structures here. Here's a closer up view of that. And you can see that it's only a part of the whole complex. Now there's some interesting astronomy going on here because, and we won't have time to get into that tonight, but the relationship between the causeway and the Ohio River has been likened to the relationship between the plane of the ecliptic and the Milky Way. Several of astronomers have written about that, going all the way back to the 1930s. And here is Squire and Davis's rendering of the great multi-ring circular. See here to the Ohio River, it's 1.5 miles just to the river. And there's something else that all of these complexes appear, this is something that's just cutting edge, that's just being discovered now, mostly through using ground penetrating radar and so forth. But what it was that many of these complexes were actually linked by a network of perfectly straight roadways. And here you can see a trace of one of those roadways that connected Newark, Ohio to Circleville, Ohio. If you look right along here, you'll see a raised bank, and here's a raised bank. And this reaches dozens of miles across the countryside. And apparently there were these, what they would do is they would build low banks that might have been 3 to 6 feet high. The roadway would have been 50 to 100 feet wide, and sometimes extending for 20 or 30 or 40 miles, linking these various centers. And of course that would facilitate the trade that apparently was going on. Okay, here we are back to the Shiloh Mound Complex. Now this to me is one of the most profound aspects of this whole thing. And here is where there is a parallel with a lot of the old world structures. How many of you are aware of or have seen the Orion Mystery, showing that the pyramid complex in the Giza Plateau mimics the constellation of Orion? Okay, well, this is the Shiloh Complex. And one of the things that the archaeologists assumed that was going on here was that these people were very much, whoever they were, presumably the predecessors of the Native American tribes that were here when Europeans arrived, but one of the things that they were very and keenly interested in their ritual activities was there were certain star groupings, such as Orion, such as the dog star Sirius, and the Pleiades. These were constantly recurring in their ritual belief systems. Well, here is the layout, and I'm just going to show you one example of this, and I think this is a great untapped field of research here that could turn out to be really incredibly profound once, if it's verified. But here is the Shiloh Complex, and here is it from the air, and here is what the Pleiades. And if you want to look here, you'll see there's an amazing correlation between the Pleiades star cluster and the layout of the Shiloh Complex. And my suspicion from my preliminary research is this isn't the only example of this. In fact, the layout of many of them may actually duplicate star maps. And here's a parallel example that we can see, like here's Angkor Thom Complex in Cambodia, which was built about 1,000 years ago. And the layout of the temples on the ground mimics the pattern of Draco in the heavens, so that you can essentially take Draco and fold it down and reproduce the star pattern. And this is what we find, which has now been independently discovered in the pyramid layout in Egypt, and it's also been independently discovered in the layout of the Gothic cathedrals in France, which I've got a whole separate program on. But what that does is it shows that the Gothic cathedrals in France duplicate the constellation of Virgo, which seems appropriate because the Notre Dame cathedrals were dedicated to the whole idea of the Virgin. So the fact that they reflect the constellation of Virgo seems more than just fortuitous. And here we get back to Newark. Oh, okay, you see what I've done down here? Here's Giza Plateau. So here you see the pyramids at the same scale as the Newark. Can you see that? Here's the Great Pyramid of Cheops, and here's the Pyramid of Khafre at the same scale as the Newark. So you can see that the Great Pyramid would actually fit inside this ring here. So here's the ring and moat structure, what it looks like now. And what we're seeing is a cross-section of this area, 30 plus acres. And you know the Great Pyramid covers 13 square acres. So it would fit very easily inside that ring right there. And inside you have a moat that was undoubtedly filled with water one time. At the time it was in use, the moat would have been much deeper and this bank would have been much higher. But over the years, you know, the bank has eroded down. It has filled the moat, so there's not nearly the disparity between height and depth that there would have been when this thing was in use. Now here is a ring and moat works at Avebury, England. In Avebury, I thought I had an aerial shot of Avebury, but you can see the similarities. They're approximately the same size. Avebury was deeper, but the idea is you've got the bank on the outside, the moat that was filled with water on the inside. So around the same time that prehistoric man or whoever was building this complex in England, you had somebody building a very similar complex in North America. Now what the question is were these two groups in any way associated or in contact with one another or affiliated, or are these two completely separate independent phenomena that somehow share these characteristics? And here is the Earth, the octagon and circle from the air. That was a photo taken in 1934. And here you can see the golf course, which existed even back then. Here's another aerial view of the circle octagon section. And this is what it looks like now from the ground. There's a golf course around it, on top of it. Okay, here's an artist rendering. Now here's where it gets really interesting. This shows the complex. Here's the ring and the octagon. By the way, there's some very interesting sacred geometry going on in all of this. But we have an axis here that goes to the most northerly extent of the moon's rising. So one could sight down this avenue through the aperture here, and one would see an exact alignment of the moon rising at the most northerly position it ever would rise in its 18.6-year cycle of risings and settings back and forth on the horizon. Okay, here's Avebury. Here's the one I wanted to show you. This is the Avebury. No, this is in the British Isles, see? But it very much mimics what we find in the New World. Yes, Hively and Horn in 1982 added a significant dimension to our appreciation of the Hopewellian achievement when they determined that the major rising and setting points of the moon, encompassing an 18.6-year cycle, are incorporated into the architecture of the Newark earthworks. They speculate that this astronomical information is not just symbolically encoded into the site plan, but that the substantial earthen walls with their long sight lines and a height that corresponds more or less to eye level are massive and therefore long-lived and tamper-proof fixed instruments for making astronomical observations. Yes, now here's an artistic recreation of the octagon and circular earthworks. And here actually is showing that the entire thing is laid out according to astronomical alignments, so that from various strategic positions within the structure, one could look out through the apertures and see a whole set of astronomical phenomena involving the motions of the moon. And it actually becomes apparent that it was an instrument for making extremely precise, detailed observations and predictions about the motion of the moon. And I'm talking here about incredible precision. And again, I hope this is raising questions in one's mind as why on earth would a hunter-gatherer society need to make observations of lunar motion so precise that it essentially was not equaled probably until the 1950s or 1960s.
Maybe they were not just hunter-gatherers.
Aha! Maybe. Maybe there's more to all of this than we've been led to believe. But see, every single key position of the moon in its very intricate motions can be determined by means of this Newark instrument. And that's what it was, an instrument. This is a map of Newark as it is today, and you can see that right up here is the Octagon State Memorial and the golf course. That's right here. And then the ring, the Great Ring, is right here, and everything else has been effaced. But interestingly, and this is a kind of a neglected avenue of research, when one looks here, I'm going to lay on the map. Watch careful. It's a little bit hard to see, but there I'm bringing in overlaid map of the original complex on the city now. And you had the Great Ring structure here. Then you had the causeways, which were raised banks. Remember, they were two sets of raised banks running parallel with a lower area in between. So that you could actually travel along these. Somebody outside it would not see a traveler moving inside the causeways, inside the banks. Now, when I study this stuff, I begin noticing, when you're trying to reassemble these kinds of things, you look for clues. And one of the most interesting ways that clues survive is through place names. Things that nobody would ever even think about twice, right? But what we're going to do is we're going to look here and let's zoom in a little bit where we can see a little closer up. Okay, here's the octagon right here. Here's the octagon, the golf course on top of it. And then I'm going to lay on the structure as it was before it was erased. So the octagon and circle is still there, but the causeways are gone. But I want you to notice, as we look here, you'll notice the street that runs right where the causeway once was. What's the name of the street? Fairbanks. And notice where the other causeway was, the second causeway, whoops, up here, that street is called Ridge Lawn. So somewhere in there, whether it was deliberate or subconscious, the names reflect what's no longer there, but was once there. And we find many examples of that when you begin doing this kind of research. Here, for example, is the Marietta Works. This is back from Squire and Davis, so this was probably the 1850s when this survey was done. And the town of Marietta is here. And let's go back to the complex. You see that there is a large square figure there, another one here, area 27 acres. I'm going to call your attention to that because that 27-acre square is something that repeats over and over and over again. There are dozens of examples of squares that are precisely 27 acres. And then right here was a graded way, it's called, that descended down towards the Muskingum River. And that graded way looked like this as it approached the river. You can get a sense of the scale of the thing. It was still there, as you can see, when the Europeans arrived. This, I believe that would be a woodcut, was probably done in the 1840s or 1850s, somewhere in there. Maybe early, maybe the 1830s. But you can get a sense of the scale just by looking at that. We're seeing that wagon is going up the mouth of this graded way right there, it's called. And you'll notice we've got a truncated pyramid with access ramps coming up to it. Here we have another truncated pyramid. Here we have a round conical mound connected to this square of 27 acres. And when you go to modern Marietta, here we will lay in the, sorry about it being blurry, but here is the complex you see outlined in red that's no longer there. But notice, Quadrennial Park. So the park actually reflects the idea of the square. And then you have the two streets here in Sacra Via Park. Sacra Via means sacred way. And here is a photograph taken by a modern researcher, winter solstice sunset, standing up looking down that graded way. And the graded way is, as you can see, the two streets. And this is called Sacra Via Park. So originally the two mounds went up this way. The river is down here out of sight. So as you sight down this axis, it was precisely aligned to the winter solstice sunset. And so this is Sacred Way Park. So again, there's many, dozens of examples that you can find like this where the place names reflect some ancient reality. And that's a whole fruitful field of study in itself. And we won't have a whole lot of time to get into this tonight, but I've done a whole analysis of the geometry, of the sacred geometry of these structures to show how they're consistent with the sacred geometry of ancient structures from all over the world. For example, here is this is the mound with the four ramps that we saw in Marietta just a couple of slides back, and superimposed upon that is a rectangle out of sacred geometry, which is known as the square root rectangle. And the square root rectangle is found in many examples of structures. This is Angkor Wat in Cambodia, which interestingly was being built at the same time this was being built. And when we look at the ground plan of Angkor Wat, notice the yellow border is exactly the same proportioned rectangle. The square root 2 rectangle has very interesting geometric properties, and it was used throughout many examples of monumental architecture from the ancient world.
Is So like the length is square root of 2 times longer than the width or something?
That's right. It's called a root 2 rectangle because the length of it, it's generated by, in geometry, there's a simple principle. If you start with a square, which is 1 unit on a side, its diagonal will be the square root of 2. So any carpenter knows that if you've got a 1 foot square of 12 inches, multiply that by the square root of 2 and you have almost 17 inches, which is the length of the diagonal. And this is one of the rectangles that we find recurring over and over again throughout ancient architecture. It also occurs in some rather interesting places in nature, particularly in vibratory phenomena. The root 2 governs relationships between certain sound phenomena and certain color phenomena. But that's beyond the scope of tonight's talk. Okay, here's the famous Stonehenge. And you can see that Stonehenge, the original, before the stones were set up, it was a ring and moat structure, very much like what we find at Newark and at dozens of these other places. So to what do we attribute this? Do we attribute it to the fact that there's just some common impulse in human beings to build large circular structures out of earth with moats inside of them and align them to key astronomical events? I don't know. I mean, if we were placed in a situation where we were living like they were living, hunting and fishing, presumably, growing corn, living close to the land, would we have any motivation whatsoever to do this? This is the Sarsen stone ring of Stonehenge. And what's significant about this is there's a key geometry. There's a sacred geometry of Stonehenge. And again, we're not going to have time to get into that tonight. That's why we were going to do this in 2 episodes. 10 minutes or 5, okay. Because I wanted to first of all use tonight to introduce you to this phenomena. So you go, hey, there was this thing happening. You know, now let's look into it deeper. Let's look into what was the meaning behind this astronomy and this geometry and all of the other things that seem to link it with similar phenomena from all over the ancient world. But in Stonehenge, there are some key dimensions. And 2 of them here that I want, one particular one I want to call your attention to is this right here. The outer face of this Sarsen stone circle is 105.6 feet in diameter. And the average length of the Sarsen stone lintels, as you see right here, is 10.56 feet. So you'll notice that the average length of these lintels is 1/10 of the total diameter of the structure. Now this would lead most researchers to believe that there was a unit of measurement being used and that whatever this unit of measurement was, it gave a length here of 10.56 feet, and when you had 10 of those together, it gave you 105.6 feet. Now we measure things in terms of miles today, 5,280 miles, 5,280 feet in a mile. What's the origin of the mile? What part of the world does our mile come from, of 5,280 feet? It comes from England. But from when? Well, we don't really know, other than the fact that it's very old. But when we look at this right here, what's interesting is that you multiply this number right here by 50, and you have exactly a mile. So in other words, the outer dimension of Stonehenge, 5 times 1,056 is 5,280, the number of feet in a mile. So you could take Stonehenge and line them up, 50 of them, and you'd have exactly a mile. So that suggests that perhaps the mile and whatever unit of measurement was employed at Stonehenge had a common origin. Now, the significance of this 1056 will become apparent as we proceed through here, and I've got to speed through this stuff because this is some of the sacred geometry, but let me show you. Okay, here we go. Let's see what we got here. Okay, let me keep going. Okay. No, this isn't. We'll look at this after the break. We're almost there. Let's see. Yes, here we go. Many of these circles, as you can see, now these are based upon the most accurate surveys. Diameter of the circle, 1,050 plus feet, probably originally 1,056. Mound City, Ohio, diameter of the circle was 1,056. Diameter of this circle, 1,056 feet. Diameter of the inner circle, 1,056 feet. So we find that there are approximately a dozen of these great ringed circles that are 1,056 feet. 1/5 of a mile, precisely. Or 1,056 is 10 times the diameter of Stonehenge, precisely. Now, what would this suggest, possibly? That were they using the same system of measurement? Well, what we've seen here is not enough evidence to conclude they were. It's enough evidence to make an hypothesis to test. When you begin to look into it further, though, you discover that this is just the tip of the iceberg, that they were using systems of measurement. And what appears to be the case is that those units of measurement were the same as the units of measurement being used in the old world to build structures there as well as here. Yes, Caleb Atwater back in 1820 said, "What surprised me on measuring these forts was the exact manner in which they had laid down their circle and square, so that after every effort by the most careful survey to detect some error in their measurement, we found that it was impossible, and that the measurement was much more correct than it would have been in all probability had the present inhabitants undertaken to construct such a work." And we will save this for after the break. We're going to take a little break, and then we'll go into the second part of this. Any questions? Or comments?
Have you found that some of these works are created as measurements for solar and others are lunar?
Yes, yes, definitely. Some are predominantly solar, some are predominantly lunar, and some seem to incorporate both. Yes. Okay. Who can handle a calculator? Sarah? Okay, now we're going to have to, Sarah, hopefully we can trust your calculations, but I want to show you something very interesting here before we go on, and this is an example of the kind of research that I think could open some of these doors here. I have done, one of the things I've studied a lot in is systems of ancient measurement, and I've got a whole set, you can see here, of different units of measurement from the ancient world and also down to our own modern times. The basic one that I start with is this one called a Sumerian Shussi, and it was determined from studies of Gidea's tablet found in 1881 by Desarzek while excavating the ruins of Lagash, which was one of the big Sumerian cities, famous Sumerian cities. The tablet contains the inscribed ground plan of a temple accompanied by a graduated rule with 16 equal subdivisions. The digit called a Shussi in the cuneiform text was found to be equal in length to 0.66 inches. So we have this thing called, we'll call it a Sumerian foot, which was 16 of these Shussis. So, Sarah, what I would like you to do is put in 0.66 inches and multiply that times 16 and tell us what you get for a result.
I'm sorry.
Oh, put in 0.66. That was the length. That was 2/3 of an inch, basically. 16, that gave the Sumerian foot, which was the basic unit of measurement in ancient Sumeria.
Oh,
And what did you get?
10.56.
10.56 inches. Now, have we seen a number similar to that? Yes. We've seen it in Stonehenge, and we've seen it in the American earthworks, or some multiple of it. We're seeing earthworks that are 1,056 feet. What does that mean? Well, if it's what you just calculated was that the Sumerian foot The Sumerian foot was 10.56 inches. So if you have 1,200 of those exactly, you've got 1,056 feet. So it is totally correct to say that these circles, or these circles that are 1,056 feet in diameter, are 1,200 precise Sumerian feet in diameter. And also it appears that when we look at Stonehenge, they were also using a Sumerian foot. Now, does that mean that Sumerians went up and built Stonehenge and they came over here and built these earthworks? Or does it mean that perhaps the Sumerians inherited a system of measurement that was also common to the megalithic builders of ancient Egypt, as well as to the monumental earthwork builders of North America? That's the question. Or is it just a coincidence? Now, if this was the sole example of this, I would say it could be a coincidence. However, it's not the only example. And by analyzing ancient measurements, we can now go into the structure and patterns and designs of these ancient structures and try to determine what units of measurement they were built by. Now, everybody in here clearly would be able to figure out, for example, like this stick right here. It's 39.37 inches. So on this side, it's a meter, and on this side, it's a yard plus 3 1/3 inches. Well, a yard is 36 inches. 3 feet, 12 inches each. Now, anybody who's tried to work on cars knows that you can't work on a foreign car using American wrenches. You have to use metric wrenches. And it doesn't take you probably more than a minute to figure out, if you've got a set of metric wrenches and it doesn't fit, it doesn't take you long to figure out that, wait a second, this is in a different system of measurement here, right? Likewise, in analyzing a building, a structure, you could go in with your measuring tape and you could have a metric measuring tape and an American, which is actually British, the ancient British system, and it wouldn't take you long to figure out which system was used to construct a building. Now, of course, in America, it's all feet and inches, you know, so typically you will find modules that are even multiples of feet, or 12 feet 6 inches, or through having a broad enough statistical database, you can easily derive a system of measurement that was used. So, in essence, it's like doing the same sort of principle, applying it to this. You go in and you would do accurate surveys of these structures, bearing in mind, of course, that they have eroded and probably shifted around somewhat. But what you would do is you would want to have enough measurements so that you could begin to try to decipher whether there was, in fact, common units of measurement used throughout. And some work is being done on the North American structures, but again, hampered by the fact that so many of them are gone, you know, and have to only be accessed from ancient surveys. But like we can look at the Assyrian foot here, and we discovered that it's 1.08 modern feet. And remember I pointed out to you that there was multiple earthwork squares that were exactly 27 acres? Well, a 27-acre square turns out to be 1,080 feet on a side. So, as it turns out, 1,080 feet is precisely 1,000 Assyrian feet. And examples like this can be multiplied. It appears that these things in ancient America were being built using a system of measurement that was common to the so-called Old World, was being used in megalithic Britain, was being used in Sumeria, possibly in Egypt as well. So what, if anything, would this imply? Let's assume for the sake of argument that it's not a coincidence. What could this imply?